here with Janine Fondon, professor at Bay Path University, who for the 5th year has organized a giant conference directed towards women called Women on the Move, where women who have made history are invited to share their stories. Community leaders are invited to share their stories. The students themselves also share their stories. And it is really like a big, let's look at our history. Let's look at the giants in our history. Janine, what inspired you to, I should say, Professor Fondon, what inspired you to come up with this idea?
Well, I think when I think back, some of us may have heard of the Pan African Historical Museum that was launched by the great Lawana Hood, who is now passed on. But her whole legacy was to present a world to us that we really didn't know, and this was the world of Africa. And that whole idea to me, and I know the community just thanks her so much for enlightening us all to learning more about our history, and that was very, to me, inspiring, and it really spurred a great friendship with us over the years of digging into our history. And I think all this work around On the Move, as I moved into academia, I could really see that students needed to know more about our history. Students needed to know. And then as I launched out into the community, understanding there were so many good things being done that we needed to capture these things. And then I really think back to of my own family, of the history makers in the family, and saying, we didn't know about this. I think there's so much about our families we don't know, and how strong, and in this case, the women in our families have had to be. And so all of that culminated in the fact that we need to learn more about the past and work more to secure the future that we all want to, and come to a shared understanding. And there was no greater inspiration than the great Lawana Hood.
You also curated an exhibit at the Springfield Museum celebrating our ancestors, and talk about it in your own family.
Yes. Well, two things. One, I want to thank you because you're in our exhibit as well, bringing the history that you have in your own family, and many of us, whether known or not known. And in my family, when I thought of my grandmother, who was the title of the exhibit, who came here from Jamaica, West Indies to New York in 1917. And if you think about it, growing up, we never really heard those stories of, how they got here until we received a letter in the mail from, looking at Ellis Island, and there was going to be a relaunch of Ellis Island, and perhaps, names that have appeared on their rolls might be on the walls there, and my grandmother was one of them, and at the time, not really understanding the magnitude of that story. So that also, really it made me think, oh my goodness. And then I ended up taking my class, a class from one of the schools I was teaching at the time. I believe it was the McDuffie School. I wasn't teaching there, but I was working in communications. But I took the class, and and we saw it on the wall. We were like, wow. And for my daughter to be there as well, and my husband and all of us to witness that, we were like, wow, this is a big thing. So, and then learning about another aunt of mine, Irene Morgan, who actually won a Supreme Court case 10 years before Rosa Parks, and her case ended up to be instrumental in Rosa winning her case, and all about busing interstate and so forth. So, and that's another story we did not hear. I believe PBS was doing something, and then reporters asking questions, and we were like, did not really know. So there's so much history in these families, and from places that we've been and people that we've met, and just never understanding that it's so significant to history. So so that's where I began. And then of course in college, I did study sociology and anthropology, so I think there was a piece of me that always loved to dig up these stories.
And yeah, and it's also okay. We're in March, which is Women's Month.
Yes.
Um, you always find a way of celebrating Women's Month that's it not just celebrates women, but also because it's not just all everything is great, but it's also looking at the hard truths of
Oh,
history
yes.
and then looking at the women who who forged paths for the rest of us. Este, so what I love how you celebrate Women's Month. Are you going to continue doing this? Have you now found yourself where okay, now we're going to have the six women on the move conference
Well,
instead of
I believe I am where the communities of women would like to have it and can convene it, because I go with the voice. That whole program is generated through voices that have been raised in our communities, and there's a richness every year. I think there's a use, and you wanted to also explore some of the realities, and at the event it came up mentorship, salary, knowing our history and the pandemic. There's, that women and women of color have been adversely impacted by this pandemic, and we need to solve that. Women, especially, well, women of color, mainly African American women and Latinos, get paid less than everybody else. That needs to be solved. Mentorship, there's a lot of research that you will find that women of color particularly are not being given or able to get those positions in senior leadership. It's hard for them to get a promotion. It's hard for them to be really recognized for the good work that they're doing. So there's so many statistics that say we've got a lot of work to do in our areas. And when you look at the C-suite, that's another place that we are not there. So then you put that into decision making and other things. So we've got some, work to do. Our communities and workplaces and leadership have some work to do. And I want to stay vigilant around that as well, because we need to secure that the next generation will have more success than we have.
yes, and it's not just women's work; it's also men's work. Men
Hmm.
have to help us get there.
Yes,
Um, since they're the ones who hold the levers of power, they're the ones who can open a lot of doors. And
yes,
it's about also teaching them, if they don't already know,
yes.
about equality. And what you mentioned just before, yes, we still live in an era where women get paid less than
Hmm.
men for the same job, and women of color far less
Hmm.
este, uh, for the very same position. And so we have these systemic issues regarding gender and racism
Yes,
that we need to address. And what I find about your conference is that it raises all these questions,
yes,
and then it gives all the participants room to think about, okay, how what can they do then
yes.
to if they bring equality about?
Yeah, and the other important concept a lot of people are talking about now, equity. Everyone's saying, like let's look at diversity, inclusion, equity, and I'll add another one, belonging. The poem that by Maria Luisa Arroyo for the exhibit was, our stories belong here. And if that is the case, we want to see some of that change by anyone, men or women or any of the gender fluidities. We want to see everybody create a world where equity is really respected. And when you look at people, I tell people, you look at me and you look at others, of color and think, when they walk into the room, understanding that that's a person that probably, number one, doesn't get paid as other people do and doesn't have that experience. And how can we change that?
Thank you very much, Professor Fondon, for your time today.
Thank you. And I salute you and your work. And any way we could be supportive, we are there.